Good Monday evening. It's July the 3rd, 2023. You're tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, and thank you so much for joining in. It's been a little hit and miss for the last couple of weeks, aside from the fact that we had family over and had to have just a little bit of time off. The truth is, as most of you probably know, I had a little bit of minor surgery, and it took a bit more time to recover than I at first anticipated. But anyway, we're back in the saddle again. Glad to be with you. So much going on. So much going on. It's not going to be possible for us to cover everything just in one show, but we're going to do our best anyway. So, tonight, the true meaning of the saying, to thine own self be true. But before we get to that, of course, as always, here are a few of the headlines that I caught my eye today that I thought that you might be a little bit interested in. So, first of all, gosh, there's so much to talk about. Let's start off by just talking about, for a minute, Premier Blaine Higgs, Premier of the Canadian province of New Brunswick, who has been under a considerable amount of pressure and criticism for changes that he brought about to the policy in New Brunswick schools dealing with LGBTQ plus children, particularly trans children who want to use different pronouns and change their names at school. Now, I've talked about this before. I don't know how much of the criticism of Premier Higgs stems from his own leadership style. It's my understanding that he can be somewhat authoritative. This is what I hear through the grapevine and what I'm hearing from my contacts in the Conservative Party in New Brunswick. And so there's not a whole lot of love there for Premier Higgs. But what's being played out in the media is the idea that the criticism that's being leveled at him is strictly due to the changes that have been implemented with respect to policies concerning, as I say, LGBTQ plus children, particularly trans children or allegedly trans children. Now, why am I coming back to this? Because we have talked about this before. Because now, apparently, some mechanisms are being triggered in order to review Premier Higgs' leadership of the party. And I think that if the whole point here is the change, the substance of the changes rather than the methodology of the changes to this particular policy, then it's a patently unfair thing to put Premier Higgs through. The fact is that the changes that have been implemented in the trans policies are benign, and totally reasonable. Just to be clear again, the only change that's substantive in any of the policy in New Brunswick schools is that if a child is under 16 years old and decides that they want to use a different pronoun or that they want to use a different name, then the school has an obligation to consult with the parents first before acquiescing to that request on the part of the students. Now, one of the criticisms that's been leveled is that sometimes parents may be hostile to the idea of their children making this request. Do you think? Okay. So in response to that concern, the policy says that if children don't want their parents to be notified, which by the way is a huge alarm bell to begin with, red flags, flashing red lights should be going off. When a child says, I want to be known as a him rather than a her, or vice versa, or whatever the change is, when they say, I don't want my parents to be notified of this, that's a huge problem to start with. But even then, the policy doesn't require for parents to be notified. On the contrary, in a case like this, the parents are not notified, until the children agree, and the school then works through guidance counselors or psychologists or whatever other professionals are called in to deal with that situation. They are then working with the children in order to come up with a strategy to discuss this with their parents. And, this is a victory. This policy change is a huge victory for parental rights. But when you think about it for a second, if the children who want this change feel that their parents ought not to be notified, that itself is indicative that there are other problems here. And really, somehow or other, we have to find ways to, I don't want to say intervene, but we have to find ways to open that line of communication up between the children and the parents. And yeah, parents might be hostile. They might be just totally against it. And they might say no. But at some point in time, you have to recognize that the parents have to be at least notified. So you can't have the children doing this behind parents' back. And most importantly, expect the parents aren't going to find out. That's the fly in the ointment here of all of the criticism that's going on. You could say, well, parents shouldn't be notified. It should be simply up to the children. As if somehow or other, a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old who insists on being, having their pronoun changed at school, as if somehow or other that information isn't going to filter back to parents. And so somehow or other, you have to find a way to engage the parents on this. So the policy isn't just the right thing to do for parental rights. It's the right policy for the sake of a relationship between the children and the parents. For some reason, that has just been totally lost, however. So if you're in the province of New Brunswick, really, you have to express your support for Premier Higgs on this. I think he's doing exactly the right thing, and that has nothing to do with my personal views about the validity of the whole gender fluidity movement. Okay? It's a perfectly reasonable thing for policy for the school boards to be implementing in cases like this, and it is manifestly unjust to accuse the Premier or any other supporter of this policy of being bigoted or anything simply because they support the policy. Moving from East Canada to West Canada, here's a little bit of interesting news. As you know, as of January the 1st, passed, the BC government no longer is prosecuting crimes with respect to possession of small quantities of drugs for personal use. Subsequent to that change being made, and again, let me emphasize that that is not a provincial change because there is no such thing in Canada as a provincial criminal code. The exemption to the criminal code was given to the province by the federal government. So the responsibility here, yes, responsibility lies on the shoulders of the provincial government for having made the request in the first place and going down this hole. But you cannot exempt the Trudeau government federally because 100% the decision to go down the road was theirs, or to authorize it was theirs. So that's 100% on the federal government, on the federal Liberals. But subsequent to that decision, there was a fellow by the name of Jerry Martin, who in Vancouver opened up his own safe drugs, not a clinic, but a shop out of almost like an ice cream truck. And the whole idea being that now that their possession for personal use was decriminalized, or that at least the exemption applied in British Columbia, an exemption against criminal prosecution applied in British Columbia. Now that that was in place, he felt that the next step was to ensure that whatever the drug supply was, that it was going to be safe, etc. Anyway, the police did step in, and they did enforce the laws as they continued to be applicable. In other words, you couldn't just open up a drug shop and start selling cocaine and heroin and all of these things, which he said were tested and perfectly safe. Anyway, why am I bringing this up now? Because apparently Jerry Martin has now died of, ironically, or maybe not, an overdose. So, rest in peace, Jerry Martin. Which just goes to show you, I guess, it doesn't really matter that there are safe injection sites in Vancouver, because he was clearly not using one. Otherwise, how would he have died of an overdose? Unless, of course, the drugs were tainted in some way, but that's not the story that we're following on that. That's not what seems to be coming out. Let's move back to not Eastern Canada, but Central Canada. Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, the Canadian equivalent of the IRS, our tax department federally, firing a handful of employees, 20 so far, late last week, for taking CERB money, CERB being the grant that was being paid out by the federal government during the height of COVID lockdowns. If you found yourself laid off because your business was closed down by order of the government, predominantly, then you could apply for this grant, a monthly payment or bi-monthly semi-monthly payment, to help cover your costs of living while you were not drawing a salary. Apparently, these tax collectors were continuing to draw salary from the federal government at the same time that they had applied for and were getting their CERB grant, C-E-R-B. I'm not sure what that acronym stands for exactly. Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit or something like that. Which just goes to show you, okay, even the tax man can't be trusted with his taxes or her taxes or their taxes. Anyway, in international news, moving south of the border, over the past few days, the U.S. Supreme Court has made two very important rulings in that country. U.S. Supreme Court, if you're from the Toronto Star, I hope you're paying attention, because the headlines in the Star kept on referring to the Supreme Court decision. Well, the Supreme Court here in Canada made no such decision. So, you would think Toronto Star, get it right. It's not the Supreme Court, it's the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional race-based criteria using race as criteria for admissions into colleges, otherwise known as affirmative action. So the U.S. Supreme Court declared that, as it pertains to colleges and universities, that practice as unconstitutional. Huge, huge decision in the United States that's going to have major ramifications, I think, moving forward. It's going to take some time for the ripple effect to work its way through everything so that we see what all of the consequences are going to be from this. But in another decision that was not quite as widely reported, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the right of religious business people to decline to provide services to groups and individuals that do not adhere to or respect their religious sensitivities. Now, we're all familiar, perhaps, with the case a few years ago of an individual baker who did not want to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage. And they got into a lot of trouble over it. Well, this particular ruling deals with that particular subject. So in the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that if you are, for instance, a printer or a baker or a party organizer, and somebody comes to you and says, we want to do this, it's a same-sex marriage, for instance, or we want you to print our flyers for a pride parade, for instance, then you have the right to refuse, if, of course, it happens to violate your religious principles. So that's a very big ruling as well. Didn't get quite as much attention as the affirmative action one did, but it did get enough attention. What else is happening in the United States? You notice how I'm not even getting into this whole Russia, Wagner Group rebellion stuff and that. I'd like to, but I think like most people, we're still trying to sort out exactly what happened and what continues to happen there. So that's sort of like a moving target. But I did want to mention this, the state of California. We've talked about this before. The state of California has been considering the idea of providing reparations money to descendants of slaves in that state. Well, apparently a report now was commissioned and has now been publicized, dealing with reparations to African Americans in the state of California, on the grounds that the legacy of slavery in the United States is completely negative, etc. The report, over 1,100 pages long, and it proposes that the state of California formally apologize to families who are descended from slaves and to offer them some sort of financial compensation. I'm certainly not going to defend slavery, but, you know, at some point in time, you have to just settle down and stop blaming the fact that something happened 150 years ago to your ancestors for whatever your problems are today. You know, at some point in time, you have to buckle down and fix the problems they are today. And don't accuse me of not understanding. I do understand. I get it. And I'm not underrating the complexity of the issue or the challenge that comes along with necessarily being a descendant from slaves. But my guess is, and it's more than just a guess, that there are an awful lot of people out there in the United States who are descended from slaves who have actually done quite well for themselves. Thank you very much. And so whatever's holding people back, it's probably not accurate to say that slavery is the cause. It may be a contributing factor, the legacy, but there are lots of other variables that have to be considered. So I think this is a very bad idea. And just one more reason why I think people are just fleeing the woke state of California. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's time, I think, for us to go for our first break. So when we get back, we are going to get into this whole discussion about the saying, "To thine own self be true." And what is the real meaning behind that? What is it really teaching us? So stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on The Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thanks for staying with us. It is Monday, July the 3rd, 2023. 2 days after Canada Day, or Dominion Day, as I like to call it. And of course, we are on the eve of July 4th, the Independence Day in the United States. So if you are joining in from the United States, happy Independence Day. And if you are joining in from Canada, a belated happy Dominion Day. Of course, today was the long weekend, Monday, from Dominion Day weekend. So it was a statutory holiday here in Canada. If you aren't in Canada and the United States, what can I say? I hope you still had a good day, and I hope you're still going to have a good day tomorrow, one way or the other. So we're all familiar, ladies and gentlemen, I think, with the saying, to thine own self be true. And as the saying continues to go, well, let's just do the whole saying, actually. To this above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night, the day, thou canst not be false to any man. So we've all heard that saying. The source of the saying is a Shakespeare play, Hamlet. And the person who is giving that advice is a fellow by the name of Polonius, who is the chief minister of King Claudius in that play. It comes from Act 1, Scene 3. And Polonius is giving advice to his son, who is going off to university. So this is a farewell, not so much a speech as, my son, listen carefully to the advice I'm going to give you. Take heed, pay attention, and if you follow these particular rules, you're not going to get into any trouble. You'll be a respected person, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, many of you may not actually have known that the quote actually came from Shakespeare, but it does come from Shakespeare, and that's important to remember as we get into a discussion here about what the saying really means. So when Polonius is giving advice to his son, there are a few other things. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Maybe people have not heard that one too much, but I'll guarantee you've heard this one. Neither a borrower nor a lender be. And of course, the rest of that quote is, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. And then, of course, immediately following that piece of advice is this above all, to thine own self be true. Now, what is the contemporary modern interpretation of that particular verse, that particular piece of advice? As I said, we've all heard it. And my guess is that if you've heard it, that you understand what basically Polonius is saying. Be true to your feelings, son. Follow your heart, because that's what's going to make you happy. Be true to yourself. Who is the real you? Don't lie to yourself about the real you. You have to be true to yourself. Respect your feelings. Follow your heart. Or words to that effect. Okay, fill in the blanks, ladies and gentlemen. You know where I'm going with this. We've all heard it before, okay? If your parents want you to be a doctor, but you want to be a ballet dancer, follow your heart. Follow your dreams. Now, that's not necessarily bad advice, but as with all things, I think it requires a little bit of context. So before we get too far into a discussion about what I think the real, true meaning of this particular phrase is, of this particular piece of advice, let's take a step back and ask ourselves whether or not the modern contemporary interpretation that's being offered to people as advice, follow your dreams, is actually true. Be true to yourself, meaning look at yourself, who you really are deep down inside. And don't try to be somebody else or to live up to other people's expectations of you. The only person that you need to live up to in terms of expectations is yourself. How accurate is that? Well, when it comes to these kinds of things, ladies and gentlemen, I think that context isn't just important. I think context is everything. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in what context is this advice given? What is the context? What is the time and the place in particular that this advice is being given? And not just in the play itself, but by Shakespeare, the time and the place that Shakespeare himself is living in. So let's make some assumptions here, particularly in view of everything that's going on today with the whole trans movement, that we have to be true to ourselves. Okay, so the first thing you have to ask yourself is this. If that, ladies and gentlemen, if that was really what Shakespeare was talking about, okay, because forget about trans for a moment. That's a very new idea, and I'm not sure whether or not anybody in Shakespeare's time really thought that way. But there was homosexuality. There was homosexual feelings and acts in Shakespeare's time. Some people have said that Shakespeare himself might have been homosexual. So what we're being led to believe is that at the time that Shakespeare was living, that he was giving advice, or he was writing, speaking through the character of Polonius, about the importance of other people in society in that time and place to be true to themselves. In other words, using the modern contemporary interpretation and context, in other words, don't live in the closet. Be true to yourself. I don't know about the rest of you, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm having a lot of trouble believing that Shakespeare thought that it was good advice in the years that he was alive to be telling people who were gay not to live in the closet. I'm having a lot of trouble swallowing that advice or that interpretation of what Shakespeare is saying here. Certainly, if we want to take it out of Shakespeare's hand for a moment and put it strictly into the hands and the words of Polonius in Hamlet, I'm having the same difficulty. Is it really, really true that the father of this fellow going off to university for the first time is advising his son that if his son is gay, and could be other things, by the way, it could be other things. I'm just using gay as an example because that's probably the most, likely of scenarios where somebody is gay and they're being advised to, be true to yourself. I'm just not entirely sure that would be good advice in the context of the time and the place. I don't think that any father of that time and place is going to advise his son or daughter, but predominantly son, not to be in the closet if in fact they're gay. I just can't imagine any father, and by the way, remember that when Polonius is giving this advice, it's speculative. It's not like he's thinking, my son is gay and I really should support him. In the modern context, in the modern contemporary interpretation of these words, essentially what we're saying is that Polonius is telling his son, hey, son, man, I don't know whether you're gay or straight, but if you're gay, you should be true to yourself. You should be true to yourself. Follow your path. Follow your dreams, irrespective of what anybody else thinks or does. That's a recipe for a breakdown in society. I'm not saying that one should not follow their dreams, and I don't want to veer too far before the break into this idea of what the proper advice in this context ought to be. I'm just saying that it's really hard for me to swallow what we're talking about. Let's go for a break, okay? And when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about this. I think it's a really fascinating subject, and I do want to peel back the onion just a little bit more. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.
Just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for sticking with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, July the 3rd, 2023. We have been talking about the advice that we have all heard, to thine own self be true. And that comes from Shakespeare. It is one of the Shakespeare's, one of the characters in Hamlet, Shakespeare's play Hamlet, Polonius, who's giving advice to his son who is off to university. And the full quote is, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night, the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. And of course, the contemporary interpretation of that we've all heard is, follow your dreams, don't deny who your true self is, etc., etc., etc. And before the break, I was talking about how it's really hard for me to believe, given the context of the time and the place, both when Shakespeare wrote the play and the setting of the play itself, pretty hard for me to believe that that's really what Shakespeare meant. Okay, because as an example, being true to yourself, if you happen to be a gay man, coming out of the closet as gay, somehow or other in that time and the place, I don't know, it just doesn't strike me as a very plausible meaning, intent for anybody giving advice to his son going off to university. In fact, quite the opposite. If I knew my son was gay at that point in time in history, and I was giving him advice, and probably most fathers wouldn't be very understanding or accommodating or approving of anybody's alternative lifestyle at that time and place, which is problematic for the modern interpretation of the verse also. But even if I was a father who was completely open-minded about this, completely accepting, loving, cherishing my son, embracing and affirming everything that he feels, I probably would be giving him the opposite advice. Look, son, I'd probably be saying, if that's the way you want to live your life, then, that's totally up to you, but be careful not to let anybody know. That might be dangerous, might be bad for your health. So it seems to me that if we're talking about, for instance, the case of a person who might be a son who might be gay, and by the way, there's no reason for me to believe that Polonius' son is gay. I'm just using that as an example of how the advice, to thine own self be true, the advice, at least in terms of the modern interpretation of that, might not be necessarily so good for their health. All right, so what would be a better interpretation, one that I think is more accurate in the context of the time and the place, both in the setting of Hamlet and in the time and place where Shakespeare wrote this particular play, but also good advice today? What's a better interpretation of to thine own self be true? Well, I think it's this. And certainly this would be the advice that I gave my own son, our own children, and I continue to give. To thine own self be true, meaning, if I want to use the more modern sort of vernacular here in North America in any event, don't drink anyone's Kool-Aid. Verify the facts. Don't lie to yourself. Don't let other people lie to you or deceive you. And it may not be that they're lying consciously. It may simply be that what are being presented to you as facts maybe aren't entirely accurate. Maybe they aren't entirely true. And therefore, you have an obligation to be true to yourself, first and foremost, above all else, as Polonius says to his son. Above all, to thine own self be true. Now, what would be a modern context for this? Well, let's talk about climate change, for instance, and the idea that human beings are contributing to a drastic, catastrophic change in our climate, and that therefore we must fundamentally alter our way of life, our whole economies, how we live day to day in order to prevent the climate from changing. And as evidence offered by the climate change, I call them the catastrophists, are extreme weather events. The predictions are that sea levels are going to rise to a catastrophic level. And to this right now, as we speak right now, what else are we talking about? Wildfires in Canada. It must be climate change. Except that there's no evidence supporting a connection between climate change and wildfires. There's no evidence There's no real theory supporting the connection or the contention that changes in our climate are affecting weather patterns negatively to the extent that they're causing more extreme weather events, quote unquote. In fact, there's no actual evidence that, quote unquote, extreme weather events are increasing. Quite the contrary. Certainly here in North America, it's not the case. And, weather patterns and weather events are tracked pretty closely here in North America. So there is no correlation between the two. Now, my purpose here today is not to debunk the whole idea of man-made climate change. Okay, although I can't help but let the occasion pass without pointing out that we shifted in my lifetime about 45 years ago. We shifted from scientists were absolutely certain, the science was settled, that we are heading into a new ice age. And then we quickly shifted to global warming, and the result of global warming was going to be as I say, the catastrophic rise in sea levels as a consequence of melting polar ice caps, etc. Well, none of that happened. Even if global warming was true, none of that happened. And so we went on to change to, we're not talking about global warming, we're talking about climate change. And climate change isn't just about global warming, and it's not about sea levels, and now it's about extreme weather. And of course, once you start thinking about extreme weather, then other psychological things kick in, like confirmation bias. So now when you're thinking about extreme weather, you're going to start to notice extreme weather more. And that's just a normal psychological thing. It's a trick we play on ourselves. Okay. So I promised I wasn't going to get into that, and I'm not. I had to get it off my chest. But the point I'm making here is, ladies and gentlemen, that there are a lot of people out there who accept the validity of these claims without subjecting the claims to any kind of critical scrutiny. And I use climate change as an example, but in our day and age, I could be using the whole thing about transgenderism and, the idea of multiple genders and the idea of how it's psychologically damaging for somebody who feels like a woman but who happens to be a biological man, that it's too traumatic for them to be using men's change rooms. They must use women's change rooms. They must be allowed to invade women's shelters where women are going to escape abusive relationships at the hands of, yes, you guessed it, men who are not in the process of transitioning away from being men. Or at least we don't think they are. We can't really be sure because we're all talking about how people feel. And that's what it comes down to, ladies and gentlemen. It comes down to, should you be believing that your feelings are the most important things in the world and that your feelings are somehow or other completely outside of your control and that they should be dictating to you what your actions are, what your decisions are? And, here's my response to all of that. Whether you believe in God or not, by design or by accident, you have a brain. You have a head. One of the things that makes us unique in the whole animal kingdom is our ability to say no to ourselves, to behave in a way that is fundamentally different from our feelings. That is a unique and important human characteristic. And so when we talk about being true to ourselves, we're talking about sticking with the facts. Don't lie to yourself. Don't allow other people to deceive you. Now, again, let's be very clear about this. When I say deceive, I don't mean that people are purposely deceiving you, trying to get you to do things for malicious reasons. I'm not arguing that there's malfeasance here. Whether there is or isn't is beside the point. The point is that as a thinking human being, you have an obligation to yourself, and I would argue to society at large, to approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism. Now, when I mean a healthy dose of skepticism, I'm not saying don't believe anything. I'm saying that it's healthy to question things. It's healthy not to just assume that what you see at first glance is absolutely accurate. It's healthy to question whether or not your feelings are guiding you in the right direction. These are all healthy things. Healthy skepticism. Healthy skepticism, including healthy skepticism about my feelings that are guiding me in a particular direction. And when I look at it and I realize, without making feelings the most important thing in my decision, and of course they factor into all of our decisions, but when I set them aside a little bit and I say, notwithstanding my feelings, I'm going to follow this path because it's the right path to follow. And that could be somewhat because it's probably not a bad idea for me as an individual member of society to a certain extent anyway, go along to get along, as the saying goes. Now, of course, even that approach you have to be skeptical about. So it's not black and white. It's not absolute by any stretch of the imagination. But when we make decisions, we should be making decisions to the greatest extent possible based on facts. Don't lie to yourself. Don't allow yourself to be deceived by other people or even by yourself. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the true meaning of to thine own self be true. And if you're being true to yourself, it must follow, as night the day, that thou canst not then be false to any man. If truth, if facts, if your integrity is paramount to you, even if it means subjecting yourself to some certain hardship, because you believe that it's the right thing to do, irrespective of your personal feelings sometimes, then when you cultivate that integrity, that level of honesty, then you're going to be honest with other people as well. I think that's a far better interpretation. I think it's far better advice in this day and age, today, contemporary advice. And I would even argue that it's much more plausible that that's the meaning, the true meaning of to thine own self be true, that was intended by both Shakespeare and his fictional character Polonius in the play of Hamlet. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, conscious of time, let's go for our third and final break. And when we come back, today in history. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thank you so much for staying with us. I am Joseph Benamy. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Monday, July the 3rd, 2023. Okay, we are looking now at what? This Day in History. A new feature that we started a couple of weeks ago here on the Joseph Benamy Show. And if you haven't been watching us regularly, that's because I've been on and off for the past week, but we're back in the saddle again, and we fully intend to give you all 4 of our daily shows this week. So this week in history, a few things caught my eye, and I am going to, what am I going to do? I am going to just go through a couple here that I've got listed here in my computer. In the year 324, today, the Battle of Adrianople, where Roman Emperor Constantine defeated his co-emperor Licinius, who then fled to Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople. So a lot of people don't realize that the Roman Empire, at least a significant part of the Roman Empire, was ruled from Constantinople for a number of years when the Roman Empire split into the Western Roman Empire and Eastern Roman Empire. And the Western Roman Empire became, at least from the religious point of view, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And in the East, the Eastern Catholic religions became more national. So you have the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, etc. So all of that comes from the schism that occurred in Rome at that time. Fascinating reading. I really recommend it if you have the opportunity to do that. What else happened here on July the 3rd, 2023? George Washington surrendered to the French Fort Necessity during the 7 Years' War. Now, that may sound like a terrible thing for George Washington, but he does have one other point that occurred with him on this day in history, and that is that he took over during the Revolutionary War the Continental Army. What else happened on this day? Lots of things. What else? Here's something. We may talk a little bit about this more tomorrow. I'm not sure. It's something to consider. And that is that today, July the 3rd, was the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is considered to be a major turning point in the U.S. Civil War. So the Battle of Gettysburg was going on. It's not a one-day event. It's a multiple-day event. But today was a significant day in that battle. Just thinking about July the 4th and thinking about George Washington. Of course, George Washington is long dead by the time any of this happened. But still, I just thought I'd make mention of that. What else happened? The U.S. Virgin Islands on this day in, let me just double check this date, or the year, I should say. Let's see. Let me see. 1848. Yeah. 1848, July the 3rd, the slaves were emancipated in the Danish West Indies, which are now the U.S. Virgin Islands. So that was in the year 1848. And there was one more thing I wanted to mention. No, we'll put off that till tomorrow night. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's good to be back with you again, and I apologize for having been away for the past couple of days. Last week we did one show on Monday, and the week before we did a show on Monday. As I said, I was recovering from some minor surgery, and let me just take a minute to really praise some of the healthcare professionals that I was dealing with over the course of the past couple of weeks. You know, I'm a harsh, unrepentant critic of our healthcare system, but the individuals who work within that system are nothing short of saints in my eyes. And the professionalism, the dedication, the courtesy, the kindness that was exhibited to me and every other patient that I came across in my time recuperating from my surgery and in the lead up to the surgery, I can't say enough. 100% first-class service right across the board. So, we complain a lot about healthcare in Canada, but really the problems are with the system, not the individuals largely that are working in the system. And I just wanted to take a minute to express my appreciation publicly for everybody that has been in any way, shape, or form assisting me in my health issues, which, by the way, again, I want to stress are not serious, but, they were rather inconvenient. Let's just put it that way. Okay, conscious of time, so please check out the website, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. Tell your friends and neighbors about us. You'll be able to go to the library of previous shows. If you haven't caught any of them, please do check out our video library. And by the way, one last thing, while you're there, if you are a regular user of Amazon, on our homepage, we have a link below the video for Amazon. It's an advertisement. If you use Amazon regularly, click on that link before you take your next purchase or before you make any purchase to go to your local Amazon site. If you're logged in, you'll be logged in. You don't have to change anything. You'll still go to the site, but go through the site through that link. And I'll tell you why, because for every purchase that you make through our link, our affiliate link, we make a little bit of money, very small, tiny commission, but it helps to keep our show on the air and free to you, our listeners. And of course, if you're watching this on Rumble, if you haven't subscribed, please do. It doesn't cost you anything, but you will get notified when we do have a live show coming up. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to our email updates. Again, absolutely free, but like to keep you informed of what's going on, not just with regards to our show, but from time to time, other important news that's happening in the world and in our country. All right, so that's enough for today, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thanks for joining, and we will catch you tomorrow night here on the Joseph Benamy Show, where we speak truth to power and anyone else who will listen.